All right, I'm so excited for you all to be here for this next presentation. I'm going to be spending some time talking about freedmen of the five tribes along with individuals who migrated to Oklahoma during the Homestead time period, land run time period. We have used a few names for them, but this is going to teach you how to research African American people in Kentucky prior to statehood and of course afterwards. So let's get started. All right, so of course, in order for us to truly understand what's going on in the state of Oklahoma, we have to dig into the history of what was going on here. Who was here, who was doing expeditions, all of that kind of stuff plays into the state that we now know that is Oklahoma. So prior to the forced removal, okay, and a lot of times you'll hear me talking about this, it's the pre-removal time period as well as the post-removal time period. And that's important because that means, especially for those of us who are connected to the Five Nations, it's the time that our ancestors may have voluntarily came here and the time that people were forced by gunpoint and all kinds of things during the forced removal. And of course, the fact is that there were already people here prior to when our ancestors got here. Many First Nations groups were already settled in this area during ancient times. And in 1541, we have a Spanish explorer, Francisco Vasquez de Coronado, who comes with cattle and troops, as well as enslaved people who came to this area that makes up Oklahoma. After that, the area was claimed by France in the early 18th century, as well as the 1700s. And then, of course, there were additional First Nations groups that existed in this area. Then we get to the Louisiana Purchase, which a lot of people don't realize that Oklahoma was part of that purchase when the United States got the land from France. And then voluntary removal begins in the 1810s. Well, what is that? Now, of course, most of us have heard about the forced removal, the Trail of Tears, but there were individuals that came on their own volition before that. Those folks were known as old settlers. They came, they determined, okay, this is how much land I have in the east, as far as Cherokee, of course, right? I want a similar allotment in the Western Cherokee Nation. So that voluntary removal is what begins in the 10s. Then we go up to the Trail of Tears, which is the 1830s to 1840s. And that's when people were forcibly removed from the Cherokee Nation in the east, which is states like North Carolina, Tennessee, northern Alabama, and they are forced into what is Oklahoma. Now, here's the other part. I didn't know this until I started researching my ancestor slaveholder, is that my ancestor slaveholder initially settled in Van Buren in Arkansas, just over the state line, and then eventually was pushed into what we consider the Cherokee Nation proper now. So this is an image that is at the Oklahoma Historical Society, and it depicts the forced removal, right? We're talking 1830s to 1840s. You see the federal troops mounted on horses. They are driving the people away from their land in what we consider the Eastern Cherokee Nation. And you note this family, you've got the father, you've got the wife, you've got their child who is holding their hands, but notice who is directly behind them. Right in the center of this photo is an enslaved person who is carrying their stuff along the journey. And there are estimates that there were at least 3,000 enslaved people who were on the Trail of Tears, walking the Trail of Tears side by the other folks that were being forcibly removed. And that's a part of the story that I know that I did not get and did not learn as a result of learning about the forced removal. I did not know that enslaved people were there servicing their slaveholders, walking the trail, dealing with all of the craziness that happened along it, as well as enslaved labor was used to clear the roads and to provide spaces and camps and whatnot for the individuals who were being forcibly removed. So post-removal is when we get into Oklahoma becoming a territory and eventually becoming a state. And through that process, the federal government begins these land runs. And if you remember anything about old movies and the people on the horses running full speed to come and settle on the land and, you know, figure out where they wanted to be, right? That's when we have the Homestead Act and the land runs. And it happens in several stages. And a lot of it is corresponded with the land of indigenous people being taken from the federal government. There are reservations being encroached upon, like the Sac and the Fox and the Osage. Oh, hey, you know what? We have this treaty. Here's your land. Actually not. Psych, no. We're going to take more of that and we're going to make it available for public lands. And so we get the proposed state of Sequoia because the indigenous people are like, listen, you guys have psyched us out entirely too many times. We want our own state. Like, give us our own state. And unfortunately, Sequoia never came to fruition. But that was proposed on August 21st of 1905. Now, beyond there, Oklahoma is admitted as a state on November 16th of 1907 as the 46th state in the Union. And when you talk about it being admitted as a state, you have to talk about some of the first laws that were introduced. The first one being Senate Bill 1, which established the separation of races. That's the first law that was on the books in the state of Oklahoma. And this is, again, after we've eased Native American groups out of their land, encroached upon Native American groups in terms of their land expansiveness. We've allowed intruders, of course, even before the land run time period, to come in and the US government not prosecuting these people settling on land that's not theirs. We've allowed all that, and then we deem the separation of races as our first law on the books in Oklahoma. Now, in current times, we also have to talk about McGirt versus Oklahoma, which reestablishes reservation bounds for First Nations people in Oklahoma, okay? We're still dealing with the aftermath of McGirt right now, as we should be, right? What is the jurisdiction of the various nations? It reestablishes the reservation, okay? So can't you tell Oklahoma's been through a lot in its not short life, right? It's been around for a while. Okay, so now we've done sort of a bird's eye view of the history. We're gonna talk specifically about Friedman and 89ers, okay? Which are the central part of the story of Black folks in the state of Oklahoma. People ask me all the time about these pictures. The Oklahoma Historical Society and the Gateway to Oklahoma has incredible pictures on it. I got every single one of those from that. So it's wonderful. We're gonna talk more about how you search that in a second. So let's talk about Friedman, okay? And you're looking at photos of freedmen that represent each of the 5 tribes. What are the 5 tribes? They're the Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Muscogee Creek, and Seminole nations. If you go and even look at Google Maps, and I was so glad that they did this in light of McGirt, is you can actually see the boundary lines of each nation on Google Maps. So you know where you are, okay? And you know, just in case you want to know, yes, you're in the Cherokee Nation right now. All right, so who are freedmen? They're people of African descent formerly enslaved in the 5 tribes or free Black people in the nations. People do not know that there were free people of color living amongst the 5 tribes. Sally Vann, right? That's my great-great-grandmother. She married, and her sister married Ike Rogers. Their mother was a free woman of color living in the Cherokee Nation. I did not know that was even a thing until I started reading through Dawes files, and my family was talking about it, okay? And so the term freedman applies to not just the individuals who were formerly enslaved, but also their descendants. So when we come together in these spaces, we say, oh, I'm a freedman, my so-and-so, my people were, you know, we just kind of like walk it out. It's like I don't know, it's like second nature. We do this, okay? Now, let's give some context and statistics, okay? Because I think people seem to think that we're this little blip on the planet, right? No. Freedmen are much more pervasive than that. Now, I just talked to someone about a microfilm publication that was created by the National Archives, and it's from the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And the Bureau of Indian Affairs came in and counted freedmen in 1877. And based on their count, at that point, there were 3,500 freedmen. 3,500. With the other nations, 2,500 Creeks, 4,000 Choctaws, 2,300 Chickasaws, and 506 Seminole freedmen. That was in 1877. But then when we get to the Dawes era, here are the statistics. These are just freedmen who were approved. That means you have to meet the provisions of the treaty for your respective nation. With the Cherokee Nation, You, as a freedman, you had to have returned back to the Cherokee Nation within 6 months of the Treaty of 1866, which means that you have to have come back by January, February 1867. You've got to be back by that time period, right? So if people met the provisions of the treaty, that means that nearly 4,000 Cherokee freedmen were approved. That's not all the rejections, that's not all the doubtful people, that's just the approved. Based off of the last numbers that I heard Chief Hoskins say publicly, there are 12,000 Cherokee freedmen based off of that 4,000 number. So just imagine, we've got over 5,000 Choctaws, nearly 5,000 Chickasaw freedmen. The Creeks are the highest number, which to me is ironic considering that they're currently in a lawsuit right now for their freedmen to get their citizenship back, and they have the highest number of freedmen on the Dawes. So then you have to kind of question incentives. Why are you fighting the freedmen? Maybe because you know there's a lot of them. I don't know. Right? And then Seminoles is 950, but by January 4th of 1906, there are 20,000 freedmen. And we know based on geography that these people are living here. They're living in Kansas City, Kansas, or Missouri. They're in Chicago, they're in Seattle, they're in Oakland, they're in LA. We know where they all are. Does this number surprise any of you? Right, because you're here, you know. All right. So, for freedmen of the 5 tribes, we've got tribal records, right? We've got tribal rolls, just like how we talked about in the last presentation around the various Cherokee rolls. We've got 1880, 1867. You have tribal rolls like that for all of the 5 tribes, right? Or even censuses or lists. Those things exist. And they're especially important prior to 1900 because remember, Oklahoma's not a state. So we don't have a federal census like everybody else has. So you're reliant on tribal records in that time period prior to 1900, as well as newspapers and the like, okay? Then you got tribal government documents. And I'm gonna talk about the Cherokee because I'm Cherokee, so I can talk about that. But we've got, this is a courthouse, right? Aren't we sitting in the courthouse for the Tahlequah district? There's Cowiskui district, Sequoia district, right? Saline, remember that's where the salt mine was. Did you know that? Saline, salt mine, right? That's where it was, okay? People would come here to file, to marry, to do things in the room you're sitting in, right? So that means we've got tribal records. The question is, where do you find them? A lot of the stuff we have for our nation is at the Oklahoma Historical Society. We also have some sort of, we've got things at our research center, but what happened is, and you just think about it over time, folks in your family pass away, people have important documents or things, pictures. Some people don't consider them to be important. They're like, I don't need this, get rid of it, right? Or maybe we don't define the importance of it then, so then it ends up in a bunch of different places, okay? So we've got tribal documents, I've seen court records, I've seen all kinds of stuff. In fact, I think I saw where Grandpa Cooey was the foreman of a jury for Ike. For some sort of matter, some dispute. I was like, that's weird. Either way, you've got tribal governments, your typical records, courts, deeds, right, where property is being transacted. Citizenship cases. If we're talking Cherokee Nation, there were courts prior to the Dawes Commission, the Chambers Court, where freedmen were going into the court and asking the Cherokee Nation justices to bestow citizenship because they saw that it was going to be an issue later. I didn't find out about the Chambers Court and there was another court until I was reading through Dawes files and people said, I went before the court. What court are you talking about? Then they have the list of records, okay? We also have a whole ton of other stuff. Gilcrease Museum in Tulsa. Tracy, if you haven't gone, you should probably go. You have to let me know what it's like because I haven't been there yet. They have an incredible online archive. I don't know who the person is in collections, but they have been working their tail off during the pandemic. And I think it's because people haven't been coming in. So they've been scanning and uploading a bunch of stuff. And we have a bunch of documents, especially the John Ross collection. There's even bills of sale for enslaved people within the Cherokee Nation that are on the Gilcrease website. So be sure to check that out. Did I mention that was free? It's free. They don't charge you nothing. Right, and they are rebuilding it. You're correct. Thank you. See, she's up here. She's my little hype person. All right. In addition, there are other collections, right? If you're trying to research enslavement, you have to think about the fact that in order to find enslaved people, you have to trace their slaveholders and you have to follow the slaveholders to find the enslaved, okay? Now, with 5 tribes, there is a section of a large record collection called Records of Antebellum Southern Plantations. It's nothing more than a collection of records that this professor at UC Berkeley went around to different colleges and universities across the country and put together this collection of records that just talk about enslaved people. Nobody had ever done it before Kenneth Stamp. Within those collections exists one for Rebecca McIntosh Hawkins Haggerty. And if you know anything about the Creek, McIntosh is a Creek name. If you're looking at a list of enslaved people from an inventory, it's hard to see, but $500 that's highlighted there in green is not what that person got from that estate. That's their value. Now, what I know about slavery is that a lot of freedmen and formerly enslaved who were in the Indian Territory would be sold out into Texas. So you have to also consider that you might have some northern Texas research to do. And again, that's all about finding where the records are for the respective locations. Now, Gilcrease, as I just mentioned, they have a bunch of slavery-related records on their online collections. Tennessee State Library and Archives, it's just the Tennessee State Archives, they also have records with regard to the 5 tribes. I've found records where folks who were forcibly removed sued the state of Tennessee to keep from having to lose their land. Like they still kept fighting it, and the actual cases from the state Supreme Court are digitized, and they deliver them digitally. I'm so proud of my state. It took us a long time to get there. All right, Sequoia National Research Center at the University of Arkansas also has an entire section that is focused on the 5 tribes. Now, the one thing about them, and I hope they hear me, please hear me, please process your catalog so it makes it easier for us to find things. There's a lot of folks think that everything is digitized and it's online, and it is not. Only this amount is actually online. More often than not, you're going to have to go in person to see things. And because of how records have been for our people, there's so much that's not processed. Like you manually have to go through it as opposed to typing in a name and searching. All right, now, if you read through Dawes cards or actually Dawes applications, you may hear the term state Negro. And for some people, they're like, what is that? A state Negro means they aren't a freedman. That means that they weren't brought during the Trail of Tears, or they weren't brought during the voluntary removal, that they were not enslaved by members or citizens by blood of the Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Muscogee Creek, or Seminole nations. That means that these black folks came to the state in the land runs like the white folks did. And in order to delineate between the two groups, our ancestors who were on Dawes would refer to them as state Negroes. They would say, oh, well, what about your wife? Is she making a claim? No, she's a state Negro. That's what they mean, is that she was in the states, as in the United States. You have to remember, we are a nation. This is our land, our country, that's within the confines geographically of another country. That's why they use that term. They also would use the term 89ers, okay, or homesteaders. And you have to remember, especially in this area, we had the largest number of all black towns in the country was in Oklahoma. More than 50 existed in this area. Look at that. Between 1865 and 1920, African Americans founded more than 50 black settlements. And a number of those, you all, began as freedmen towns. So we're all intertwined, even though people like to use the term state Negro back then, right? So from there, you also get incredible stories, right? Like Edward McCabe, who was an early leader and founder of Langston. Who, anybody know anybody else who went to Langston University? I was about to say it's going to be half the hands in the room, right? Right? And then you've got entire systems like the college, right? We know that Greenwood wasn't a fluke. We had systems like that set up in many of these black towns. And now while they're historical and unfortunately due to the Great Migration, people have left those locations, but a lot of people are moving back, right? Because we see the value in having land and having autonomy and being able to do your own thing as opposed to being in the rat race and the traffic of the city, okay? Now, beyond that, come on, remote, there we go. There was also, after that Senate bill passed, the first one with the separation of races, there was a whole movement of black people to Canada from Oklahoma. And that story is starting to emerge more frequently now because they would advertise down here like, hey, we know they're trying to, we know they're separating races down there, come to Canada. Like they actively recruited people. All right, so now that we talked about 5 tribes and homesteaders a bit, let's talk about government records that document black folks in the Indian Territory as well as outside of it. Number 1, I just talked about M234, huge voluminous collection that is from the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And you have to manually browse this. This is not, I'm typing in a name and the magic is gonna happen. No, the magic is gonna have to happen through your eyes and through your index finger hitting that mouse, okay? And it's dated, so it's prior to removal, it's during the removal time period, and it's after removal. And you can go to the Cherokee agency, and you can go and look up letters and lists and all kinds of stuff. I found a list of people, it says, of Negro Cherokee Indians seeking assistance from the federal government to return back to their homes in the Indian Territory. And it literally was a list of all these black folks, all these vans, trying to go from Kansas back to the Cherokee Nation. And yeah, I can't even quantify or even like fully describe everything that's in that collection. So take some time and sometimes when you hit research blocks, you need something to kind of clear your mind, you just browse. Use that for that. You'll find some incredible stuff there. Military, we talked about Civil War, okay? In this area, in particular in the 5 tribes, the primary units that people would have been enlisted in are the 1st and 2nd Kansas, the 1st Indian Home Guards, the 2nd Indian Home Guards, and the 3rd Indian Home Guards. If you find anybody in your tree that has a pension card that mentions those regiments, if you're looking on like the 1910 census and one of those columns at the far end asks whether somebody was in the late war, if there's a yes there, she's looking like, they asked that on the census? They do, it's at the end. Were they a part of the Confederacy or the Union? And it will say that on that census. Yep, I think some people are staying up tonight. I saw a lot of looks like, I didn't know they asked that. Yes, if you find somebody on the veteran census, right? 1890 veterans, if they're living in maybe Kansas or some other place. But if you find these regiments, those are freedmen typically that are in those, okay? Then we got things like draft cards, which I love draft cards, as well as other conflicts, right? Not just the Civil War. With the Civil War, you saw me show earlier that affidavit from Ike Rogers' pension file. Some pension files are 10 pages, Ike's was about 80. Yes, with incredible information in interviews. You even find out things you don't want to know, like they suffer from chronic diarrhea. Yeah. Or one of my other personal favorites, there was one that I have where they were trying to prove how the veteran got his injury, and his bunkmate was interviewed, and he proceeded to give a story about how the man had contracted an STD while they were in service, but he was still married and had a wife, but he made an ointment for the man to put on his situation. I was like, why am I finding out about this in a pension like 100 years later? It's very colorful pension files. All right, so you also have service records that detail when a person enlisted, their height, their weight, if they were injured, how much money they got paid. There's all of that in there as well. Of course, you've got other conflicts. We have people in World War I, II, Vietnam. And again, your kind of note that these people were in these conflicts, especially if you find them buried in the cemetery, their headstone will tell you that they were involved in that stuff. Now, more records. United States Court for the Indian Territory. Let me tell you, if you want some good reading late at night, if you want to hear about people getting arrested for prohibition violations and all kinds of stuff like that, please, please, please head to the Fort Smith criminal case files on Ancestry. I can guarantee you, if you were a Cherokee Freedman, somebody in your family got arrested and went to Fort Smith. Guarantee you. Luckily, they did not end up hanged. But they went to see Judge Parker, and somebody like Bass Reeves or Ike Rogers would have to be the person that would have to serve the warrant for them to go to the court. So that stuff is available on Ancestry. You saw that bit of Ike's Senate subcommittee hearing where they were doing the questions and answers. You can get that on Google Books. They interviewed a bunch of freedmen that are part of that. Dawes Commission, many people, that's okay. You are, come in. He came in here like I'm interrupting. That's all right. We're good. Now, Dawes is a 3-step process, okay? Some people think that if you got to the final roll, that's it. That's the only document. It's the final roll. No. If you come across the final roll, you need to go back to the card to make sure that it's the right person on the final roll, because the card will tell you the parents' names of the person who applied. And with Dawes cards, if somebody started out on what's called a doubtful card or a D card, they could go to a regular card or to a rejected card. Okay? So some of us, our ancestors are just on regular cards. But if their case was in question, they could have started out as a doubtful and went to a rejected, or started out as a doubtful and went to an approved. I'm pointing this out because that means there's more than one Dawes file. Some of us in this room, based on your expressions on your face, came across a doubtful card and you didn't go and look for a rejected, and they tell you on the card, move to rejected card R2532. Or on the doubtful one, it'll say C, D, blah, blah, blah. It'll give you the other number to correlate with the two. That means that there's two application files. Now, once they got the card, they got the application packet. If the person was approved, then that goes to an allotment jacket, because then that means that they get land. If you aren't searching for the allotment jacket, all of this stuff is on Ancestry, okay? The cards, the application packets, and the allotment jackets. Why do you care about the allotment jackets? That will tell you exactly where the land is, where their land allotment was. It'll give you the township, range, section of where their land allotment was. In addition, it'll tell you what the land looked like when they got it. Grandpa Cooey said, I'll put some fence posts up. It'll tell you things like that. Is there anybody who's who's contending that they want this land? What's the point of the allotments? We held our land in common, you all. We didn't have deeds. What do you mean a deed? She just lives next door to me, and if she decides she wants to pick up her stuff and move, then she can pick up her stuff and move. Like, so nobody's gonna be there like, did you write this thing out and pass it to the next person? No, we didn't do that. But when Dawes came in, and then later old Tams Bixby, we had to chop our land up, and then we had to start issuing out that you owned it. And in order for everyone to get their equal portion, we had to have allotments. Don't you wish we were back in the old system? You just, the soil was better over there, you just moved, right? But that's what happened with Dawes. So Dawes was 3 parts, okay? Application card, packet, jacket. You don't get to the allotment jacket unless you were approved. So some people were just cards and packets, but if you were approved, you were part of the 4,000, you have all 3, okay? Then, again, this is for all the 5 tribes, okay? It's not just for Cherokee. Then you have things that are Dawes related, like I mentioned earlier with Equity 7071, that revolves around Choctaw and Chickasaw freedmen. These are freedmen who knew they had a degree of Indian blood, but because Indian blood was not documented on Freedman Dawes cards, they sued to be added to the by blood roll. And the case was never heard. Yes. But for those of us who are researching later, that means it produced a bunch of documents. Okay? So dig into that if you are Chickasaw or Choctaw. More, Eastern Cherokee. Most of the freedmen that I have seen were rejected for Eastern Cherokee benefits. But again, it's not a loss, not entirely, because of the genealogical information that is available. This is an example of the first page of one. This is for my great-great-grandmother, Sarah Starr. She married a few times. She ended up in Joplin. It's a long story. But she applies for Eastern Cherokee. She lists all of her kids' names. She lists her siblings' names, great-grandparents' names, all of that on that form, okay? Homestead records, we talked a little bit about that. Typically, they're referred to as land patents. You will search a database through the Bureau of Land Management. These are also available on Ancestry, where it'll show you the land patent, which is the title that a person has for the land. We also actually have one for the Cherokee Nation. For the land that we're sitting on, we have a land patent from the US government. I saw it this morning at the Research Center. All right. You have their homestead applications. That's them applying for land. Those are only available at the National Archives. Okay. More federal government records. We aren't even done. Anybody ever seen these blank lines on a page called the slave schedules? If you've watched genealogical TV with the Harvard professor with the glasses with the cane, who shall not be named, you've seen the slave schedules. And this is an example of one. Now, one thing I want to point out about the slave schedules, they happened twice, 1850 and 1860. Those were two opportunities that our federal government had to count enslaved people with specific demographics like their age, their gender identity, and their race. The initial copy or the initial iteration of the slave schedules had slaves' names on them. I need y'all to understand this. The initial version of this, where it says name of slave owner, said name of slave. But our elected officials argued on the floors of our Congress that it was not beneficial to record the names of the slaves. So our senators botched this not once but twice because they made slave schedules in 1850 and 1860. So what does that mean? That means we have no national list of enslaved people because they made a choice to take the names off. Okay? So our goal is to try to replace the names based off of what we have. Okay? Now, slave schedules exist for the Indian Territory. Many people do not know that because they're bundled in with Arkansas, because that was the federal jurisdiction. So you will find, if you go on Ancestry, Family Search, whatever, you will go on and you will go through Arkansas and you will find counties listed as Cherokee Nation, Chickasaw, Choctaw. Okay? In addition, once we get into statehood, we've got the U.S. Census in 1900, 1910, 20, 30, 40, 50 just came out last year. And the reason why you all are like, wait a minute, that census is 300 years old. Why did we just get it? Well, you're elected officials again. They put a privacy hold on the census. So you can only access the census for use for genealogy once it's reached the year, once it's been 72 years. So we're not going to get 1960 until the year 2032. Right. I know people are like, dang. But if your folks were in the territorial counties of Beaver, Canadian, Cleveland, Kingfisher, Logan, Oklahoma, and Payne, we do have a territorial census in Oklahoma as well. We also have one for Seminole County in 1907. So now that we talked about tribal records and federal records, let's get to some other good stuff in Oklahoma. All right. Of course, because it's a state, we've got vital records, right? Birth, marriage, and death. Our Department of Health is great. I'm trying to think when they set this site up. Maybe in the last 4 or 5 years, maybe 6 years, where you can actually go and search births and marriages and deaths in the state of Oklahoma. And it'll give you basic information, and you can order genealogical copies for like $5. It's actually not that expensive when you compare it to other states. Marriages are online, and they're on Family Search and on Ancestry. So you can actually pull down copies of certificates if you need those. And those even go into the territorial era in the Cherokee Nation. I find a lot of them all the time. So those are available. Deeds, once we chop up our land. There's court records, probates, again, when people have property and land and whatever they're dealing with wills and all of that, that stuff is on there. If you have minor children who got land allotment through the Dawes Commission, anytime their family wanted to sell that land, they had to be appointed a guardian, and the guardian had to be given permission by the court to sell the land off. So if you know that you have minors where that happened, you need to go to the court records, which you can do on Ancestry, Family Search, or if you are here local, go to the courthouse and seek it out, and you will find who the guardian was, how much land they sold. The only reason why I even discovered this was because Aunt Clarence, that I told you guys about earlier, she was at Western University in Quindaro in Kansas City, and she got sick with tuberculosis. And in order for them to pay for her medical care, they had to sell off part of her land allotment here. And because she was 15, she could write, she could sign her name. So they actually had her sign a statement from her bed because she couldn't go into the court. So I actually saw her signature, and she died shortly thereafter after they signed her name. So I was like, I got a hint on Ancestry for a probate. I'm like, she didn't have a family. Why does she have a probate? It's because she was a landowner. All right, school records. Now, let me tell you guys, we already have a lot of great resources, but this one right here, did you know they took a school-age children census every year in the state of Oklahoma? Did you know that? Where they would list the children's names and the name of their parent, and they used to do it every single year. That's available on Family Search. So if you're trying to see what's going on in a household and see people from year to year, you can pull that up. There are only 2 states that I know that have school-age children censuses, and Oklahoma is one of them. That's a unique record to here. The other state is Mississippi. All right, have my water hosed you enough? Because there's a lot. We've got great newspapers. Most of them are on newspapers.com, which is a part of Ancestry. So if you have an Ancestry subscription, bundle it in. Okay, you can reduce the price. I think it's like $40 or $60 a year. And search across this area in Oklahoma. They mention the Black people all the time. So this is not an issue where in other places we got the Negro news section where it's just one little column on the 3rd page every week. No, they talked about us all the time. So yes, please search the newspapers. There's an African American newspaper search on the Oklahoma Historical Society website. That is free. Please use that as well. I mentioned newspapers.com. Genealogy Bank is a backup, but in my opinion, you really don't need it in the state of Oklahoma because we got too many things. She's shaking her head. She's like, we don't need that. Right. It's just, again, it's just for an outlier. I'm trying to be as thorough as possible, okay? Chronicling America, that's through the Library of Congress. That's a free website that you can use. Pretty much all the stuff that's on the Oklahoma Historical Society site and newspapers is on Chronicling America. So if you find the search on either of those, like you don't like it, you can try the Library of Congress. Beyond that, the Pioneer Papers. This is another one of those things that's specific to us. If you heard of the slave narratives, where they went around and interviewed the enslaved, we have our own version of that in the state of Oklahoma. And they interviewed Friedman. And those folks are in there talking about stuff like, yeah, when I came back after the war, I settled on this land, and there was a bunch of shrapnel from a Civil War battle that I dug out of my yard. Everything from that to slaveholding families to their own families. You can access those. Those are on Ancestry. The University of Oklahoma has them on their website. Oklahoma Department of Libraries has a search called the Digital Prairie. You can find newspapers on there, as well as other records. Langston University has its own archive of information. Literally, if somebody came, well, you can't find that in Oklahoma. Can you kick them in the shit for me after this? Because I'm giving you all of the things, because there's a lot of things. Find a grave. Bless those people. There are folks that love cemeteries and literally walk them and go out and photograph the headstones and put them online. So if you can never get there, you can see it. And people have walked a number of the cemeteries in this area. So Billion Graves is another site that's very similar to that. It's like a big virtual cemetery. All right. Oklahoma Historical Society. Again, that's the state archives for Oklahoma. They've got Black History is Oklahoma History. That's a part of their site. They have a research center, okay? Especially when you're getting into tribal records before statehood, that stuff is going to be at the Oklahoma Historical Society. Their gateway to Oklahoma history is really, really great. They've got so much stuff there. I can't even encapsulate everything that's a part of that. But two of my favorite collections, they did a census. Oklahoma is making lists. Can't you guys see that? Yeah. They're making lists and checking them about 15 times, okay? There's an unemployed relief census of 1933. So if you didn't have any money and you became a sort of like a public charge or you needed money, you could go to your county and get it, and they got a whole list of these people with the Oklahoma Historical Society. And then the other one, the penitentiary cards. If people got arrested in the state of Oklahoma and were sentenced, they actually have their Dillinger, you know, their mugshots and the list of charges. One cousin we had, he got arrested. His wife divorced him in prison. So one of the dates that you saw was him being released to go to prison to deal with the divorce. I was like, that was just strange. You didn't find that out until you got that. So yeah. Everything else, there are a million other things, okay? But this is kind of a cornucopia of all the sorts. Many other resources. Of course, right here in the Cherokee Nation Family Research Center. We have a brand new, incredible building. It's gorgeous. You have an awesome staff who is willing to help you. Several people, or at least a couple folks who are in here today, that's where I saw them earlier today. You can go over there. Church and religious organizations. Did you even think about the AME Church? Baptist Church are the people in the Knights Templar, in the Masons, the Eastern Stars. All of that generates records, okay? Same thing with organizations, YMCA, all of that. A lot of them have historical archives. You can pull up that information as well. There are 5011 books, 5011, so many. In fact, one of the ones that came out more recently is by Caleb Gale, and it's called We Refuse to Forget, and it's all about Creek Friedman. Very good book, okay? I'm actually listening to it on Audible. Do not feel bad if you have to listen to the book, okay? You're still reading it. All right. And there are also blogs and websites. If you are looking for just general Friedman history, Angela Walton-Raji has a blog called African Native that she's run. Terry Ligon focuses on Chickasaw and Choctaw Friedman. There's just 1,000,001 resources, as well as Facebook groups for the various 5 tribes that I'm part of. We have a Cherokee Friedman genealogy group on Facebook, and people just trade resources. In fact, one of the things I posted more recently is, thanks to a suggestion by somebody who's standing in the room in a zebra jacket, the Dawes cards on Ancestry, the names of the slaveholders have been indexed and are searchable. Why is that important? Let's say you are trying to find out who else amongst the freedmen your ancestor slaveholder enslaved. Before now, you could not search to find that. You had to manually go through all of the cards. Now you can do a broad search and find out who all those people are at one time. So, any questions?